So according to their public schedules, neither President Trump nor Vice President Pence will participate in any events for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, one day after Pence quoted King's "I Have a Dream" speech to defend President Trump's border wall.
I think what the American people saw the president do yesterday was say, I want to set the table for us resolving this issue in a way that achieves his objectives to secure the border, end the humanitarian security crisis, end the government shutdown, but also to bring together the Democrats' priorities to accomplish that. That's what the American people expect us to do. And honestly, the hearts and minds of the American people today are thinking a lot about it being the weekend where we remember the life and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King was, "Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." You think of how he changed America. He inspired us to change through the legislative process to become a more perfect union. That's exactly what President Trump is calling on the Congress to do.
This from an administration that separated children from their families, and the numbers are bigger than we even thought. Okay. So joining us now, along with the Reverend Al, we have got Joe Madison, civil rights activist and radio talk show host. But first, Reverend Al, let's just talk about those comments, and if I could ask you to respond to those as best you can, and what would Dr. King make of the state of American politics today?
Well, I think that, first of all, if you listen to the quote, I think the vice president did not really understand what he was quoting. Dr. King said, "Make American democracy, live up to American democracy." Well, you don't live up to the promise of American democracy by barring those that want to seek asylum here because they're not enjoying democracy where they are. So not only is it a miscarriage of Dr. King's quote, he doesn't even seem to understand the English and the language Dr. King was using. But Dr. King has been quoted. I played last night on Politics Nation with his son sitting with me, Martin III, talking about the Berlin Wall and saying how we should not build walls. For this president and vice president to not even have a scheduled appearance on King Day, but to misuse a quote of Dr. King while they have 800,000 federal workers not being paid, when Dr. King was assassinated marching for workers in Memphis. Let's not forget, Mika, Dr. King was in Memphis fighting for workers. Workers today are being furloughed and not being paid on Dr. King holiday. They had to get gifts in order to keep the Martin Luther King Park open today for Martin Luther King Day. And the president and the vice president would misuse a quote and not even celebrate his official federal holiday. So not only have they closed down federal workers' paychecks, they've in effect ignored a federal holiday that was signed by Ronald Reagan.
Well, and honestly, using it to really push the concept of the wall and other really I guess, ideas that I don't think the entire American people support. 75% of Americans don't even think the wall is important at this point, but it's manipulating the legacy of Dr. King, in my opinion. Joining us now, radio talk show host on the Urban View channel at Sirius XM and civil rights activist Joe Madison. In fact, less than a year after his D.C. speech, Dr. King gave a sermon in East Berlin where he specifically addressed the Berlin Wall, which divided the city from 1961 to 1989, saying, quote, "Here on either side of the wall are God's children, and no man-made barrier can obliterate that fact." Joe, the NAACP called Pence's comments an insult. I would go further. I would say this administration is taking the legacy and using it to further their political needs.
And let me add another iconic speech that Dr. King gave in an amazing sermon when he said the two most dangerous things on the planet: sincere ignorance and/or conscientious stupidity. And unfortunately, I think in Pence's case, that both are combined. You know, the sad thing is, and Reverend Sharpton is absolutely right, Dr. King was about freedom. Walls are not about freedom. Dr. King was about freedom. Making people go to work without pay is not freedom. We consider it slavery. The reality is that African Americans today make up 18% of the federal workforce. So we're disproportionately on this holiday impacted by what the Trump administration has done. I mean, we're 33% of the entire civil service workforce, from policemen to military. This was just absolutely ridiculous, and I would suggest that before Pence says anything about Dr. King, he ought to listen to some of his speeches. I would say that Donald Trump ought to read, but we know that that would be wishful thinking.
He doesn't. He doesn't read. You know, the shutdown has, of course, closed parks across the country. That includes the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park in Atlanta, which is reopened on this day thanks to a grant from Delta. So private corporations, of course, stepping in with this government is not, I mean, this presidency, this president, this vice president, not only using the legacy to push political needs forward, but they're not taking the day to take a look at the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They have not one event.
I mean, even Ronald Reagan, as we both know, he invited the King family to the White House at the time he signed a bill. By the way, it was Ronald Reagan who ran and said he never would sign it, but he did. So the reality is that what we need to do today is not so much worry about what Donald Trump is going to do, how ridiculous Vice President Pence said. We should do two things today. One, celebrate the man, and number two, live the message.
John Hellman.
Rev Al, I want to ask you the question. I mean, given what we know about Donald Trump, given what we know about, you know, the extraordinary statement of this history of racist comments and racist behavior that's beyond any reasonable argument about where he is there anything that he could do on this day that would not be looked on by anybody who cares about civil rights as somewhere between ludicrous and hypocritical?
I think that what he could do is immediately put the government back to work and say he will pay the workers. I think that it would be beyond even the hope of the most hopeful minister or civil rights leader, to answer your question, that he would do something that would bring about some racial reconciliation. But you have people that voted for him that don't know how they're going to buy their groceries or put gas in the car. So even if he can't be king-like, at least have empathy and sympathy for the people that put him in office. And I think that Dr. King, if he were alive, I would guess would not be looking for him to celebrate his birthday, but at least do something humane.
Hey, Joe, Nick Confessore here. I'm kind of curious. You know, I think it almost bespeaks a self-awareness of the White House to not have too many events commemorating Dr. King, because it seems to be that his politics and the president's politics are deeply opposed. And I wonder if Dr. King was alive today, given all the issues that we're debating about racism and the wall and our national policies, where he would be and what he would be doing.
Well, let me say first, I think he would celebrate the fact that we have people like Congressman Elijah Cummings, who, by the way, is going to be chair of a very powerful committee. Maxine Waters, finance, very powerful committee. You know, others that are in leadership position. No question he would celebrate that. He would certainly be fighting, as we all should, voter suppression. The fact that the Trump administration is trying to tear the heart out of what Dr. King fought for when it came to the Voting Rights Act. I think he would also remind us that, you know, that he lived in a time of what we referred to then as Jim Crow. Today, it's James Crow Esquire. Nobody is dumb enough to issue a memo to say that you can't rent to black people or people of color. They're a lot more sophisticated than that, and I think that Dr. King would remind us that we have to be sophisticated, we have to recognize what we're facing, and that we've got a president of the United States who is literally trying to tear the guts out of the civil rights movement. I mean, even his Department of Education is opposed to affirmative action that would help students of color get into college. They have opposed disproportionate punishment when it comes to students in classrooms, young black kids getting disproportionately punished, either expelled or suspended, which leads to what? A classroom to prison pipeline. That Department of Education has opposed that. These would be the things he would be asking us to fight for and to fight against.
A radio talk show host on the Urban View channel at SiriusXM. Joe Madison, thank you very much for being on this morning.
Anytime.
And coming up, Rudy Giuliani says, so what if Donald Trump talked to Michael Cohen before his testimony to Congress? We're going to go inside the special counsel's decision to dispute BuzzFeed's explosive story. That is ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.